Behold, my glorious supporter Scoomslayer has requested some discussion about power budget. Huge topic for making builds or developing a playstyle, customizing your character or your team or whatever in a lot of games. Specifically, you gave a lot of examples from Azurlane, and in this parlay, I'm mostly going to talk about it from an overview perspective, but there are a lot of good examples in here that really helped prompt what I have to say about this. So I appreciate them. I would feel bad if you felt like I wasn't reading through all these examples, but there's way too many. We'd be here forever. Scoomslayer says, for my October parlay, I'd like to talk about power budget and how value weighting of various stats might even differ depending on the slot and class and combinations thereof. Yeah, that's a great place to start. Something that it seems like a lot of people in the world at large playing games, probably not a lot of you, but a lot of people, don't understand about game design is that context can make it meaningful to make something more or less powerful. For example, let's imagine a hypothetical game where there are three classes. One of them is a sort of melee fighting focused class, a warrior. One of them is a ranged attacker, a marksman. And one of them is a utility caster, a wizard. And to summarize, basically, the warrior is really good at doing damage in melee range, which incurs them some risk and means they can't do much damage unless they're near enemies. But it means they, get to do maybe more damage. They get to hit more enemies at once. Maybe they can cleave through a few enemies. The range character can more easily hit enemies because they're at range, but they're probably less durable. They're probably not as capable of hitting multiple enemies at once. And let's imagine that the wizard I just said the ranger, didn't I? The marksman. I'm imagining guns. And the wizard, or the magic user of whatever sort, is more versatile. They have a lot more effects that buff or debuff enemies, buff allies, debuff enemies. They have a lot of utility. They can do a lot of unique things, but their raw damage output is simply lower, and they are also not particularly more durable. That is, in terms of strictly fighting enemies directly, they're worse in most ways than both the warrior and the marksman, but they have versatility. Now, in the context of these three classes that we've created, it's easy to imagine how getting the ability to heal has different value for each of the three different classes, even though the heal might be the same amount. Being the melee character, for example, it's interesting because you're probably tankier. It's probably good game design to let that character be tankier, but they also maybe want the heal a little more, or like if the heal is large, they're more likely to have the room in their health bar to store a large amount of, it sounds weird to say this, but damage. They can take a lot of damage without dying, and then a big heal has maybe more value. If you use it at the right time, the ceiling for how good the heal is better. The ranged character, the marksman, probably gets the least out of a big heal because they don't have as much of a health bar to fit it, and they can be away from enemies pretty easily, meaning they're not as likely to take damage in the first place. So it may be less valuable if it's a self-heal, while it might be even more valuable if it's a ranged targeted heal. They have a lot of time to do it. Finally, the wizard, or the utility caster character, it's weird because they probably have a lot of things they want to be doing, so it's likely not very good for their sort of time economy. They might be taking turns or just time doing a lot of other little effects to have an impact on the battlefield, or maybe it's easy for them to do that, so the heal is valuable. It depends how they're designed. But it's easy to imagine how, like, lifesteal is of different value to these three classes. The melee character can't always use it, but pretty much always gets a benefit from it, and might be able to cleave and hit multiple enemies. Lifesteal is likely very good for the warrior. The marksman, it's hard to say. It's good that they have a heal, maybe, if they're a little less tanky, and they would be able to use it frequently, but they might not need it frequently, so it's a little weird. And the ceiling for how valuable it is probably lower because they can't hit as many enemies. All of this is to set up an example, a picture of how using various different restrictions or classes, the same item might have different value in different scenarios. In the context of Azurlane, which I know largely nothing about, Scoomslayer gives the example that there's a gun that you can kind of put on any ship that's kind of slow firing and, maybe not the greatest anti-air weapon or whatever. But because there are some ships that are lighter and just don't have as high firepower overall, the marginal benefit, that is how much you gain by adding one of these when you don't have any, of adding this to a smaller ship is relatively higher, just because it doesn't have as much firepower to work with to begin with. If you have a damage increasing item, in my 3 class example, it probably gives the wizard the most benefit because they lacked they had the least damage. So giving them, overall at full blast, the warrior does 50 damage per second, and the marksman does 30 damage per second, and the wizard does 10 damage per second. It's easy to see how the damage increase is the most noticeable on the wizard because they have the lowest damage. Adding 10 damage per second doubles the wizard's damage, and the class was probably balanced around them having lower damage per second, meaning that you'll notice the impact a lot more. Or the ways the wizard does damage may make better use of the damage increase. Maybe they apply it to more enemies or something. I'm thinking the warrior, since they can cleave, also it's likely it's valuable because they already have a lot of damage, but they can maybe hit multiple enemies. For the marksman, it is likely the weakest because they don't have as many multi-target attacks, the way I've designed them anyway in this example, and they also have relatively higher damage to begin with. So the marginal benefit, how much they gain given how much they have, is not as high as for the wizard, and they can't multiply the benefit of even a small marginal benefit the way that the warrior can by cleaving. The key example here, I think the interesting thing to discuss with this parlay, is how that very concept, understanding that concept, many savvy developers often go a step further and manipulate which things are available for which classes based on how good they would be for each class. For example, in the game I just described with my wizard, my warrior, my marksman, the item that just gives you 10 damage is just like sort of pointless if you're in a group with any other classes other than marksman. So why, shouldn't you make it more interesting? Maybe there's a variety of items available and you distribute them. But why not call to that? Maybe the marksman has some ability that really takes advantage of that. So there is a motivation, or there's a reason to approach it that way, rather than making the item just boring to equip there. That kind of comes into this new player trap territory where it appears that an option is just even more damage. And maybe the marksman has really good single target damage. So it feels like adding more damage to the marksman is the best to a new player, because then they get the maximum damage output. But it's only on one enemy, and there are maybe lots of enemies, and this game is Warframe. Go figure. It's a game with a lot of enemies. It's like a horde shooter or a horde fighting game or something. So high single target damage is just kind of relatively meaningless. You want the highest total damage output. In fact, area of effect damage is likely very good most of the time in this game. So outside specific situations, a newer player might get distracted by the value they're imagining where they do tons of damage to one enemy, but there's like 50 enemies. And so it ends up being not so good. Understanding this kind of balance is really interesting and opens up a lot of possibilities, and helps you sort of understand in the context of the game where things might fit, adds this kind of puzzle of understanding to a game. From reading all these examples you gave from Azur Lane build stuff, the different weapon options, the different kinds of ships, it seems like this is a game that has an element of that. A lot of games with build options in them, generally have kind of one or the other or both elements. Either they kind of have a puzzle to be solved. Doom is a good example. In Doom, you have a lot of different guns, and some of the game's combat is about understanding where each of those guns is relatively more effective. Both understanding that certain guns are good at a certain range, so when enemies are at that range, you might like that weapon, and also which guns have a unique effect or uniquely counter a certain kind of enemy. Maybe an enemy has a shield that is overloaded by plasma shots, for example. The plasma weapon may or may not be at the range where that makes sense, but it has a specific interaction with that enemy. And once you solve all that stuff, you kind of have the tools on the table. You understand what the options are. This is very much like in your Azur Lane example, where there is a gun available for every ship, but you realize eventually that it is more marginally valuable on destroyers because they gain the most from it relative to other ships. That makes sense. That's something to understand, and then you kind of have that tool on the table. There are other games where you kind of, that's maybe obvious, or you don't go through the process of figuring that out, and then you're kind of choosing which options you want to combine given those tools, or you can succeed without doing that. Genshin Impact is kind of like this. It's a game where you can build a character a lot of ways. You just have to understand what each way does, and then you can adapt things as you will. But a lot of the time, games have both elements. They have kind of a set of tools that you need to understand and digest and kind of solve or own. And then once you know that, you can kind of apply them to the stuff in the game and gain unique advantages. So for example, Genshin Impact is actually a good example, but like in Warframe, you have a primary, a secondary, and a melee weapon, and some others. And it is helpful, it makes your overall loadout more powerful, to understand that of the secondary weapons in the game, many of them are a gun. They're not generally like an explosive or some kind of weird, like a bow or whatever. A lot of them are a pistol, like a gun. Many of them are just a firearm. And primary weapons are often kind of weirder. It's not always true, but it is broadly true that in the context of primary weapons, being a utility weapon is a little less valuable because there are a lot of weapons that do pretty specific things and solve specific problems. Getting a secondary weapon like that is a little more powerful than it would at first appear. A secondary weapon with a utility effect in Warframe is kind of almost passively more powerful in a way a lot of players don't understand, because it's competing with less things. There's less things that you'd want to put in that spot, right? And understanding this allows you to take advantage of things and get value out of things that wouldn't on the surface immediately seem to be obviously valuable. It's like, why would I particularly care about this? And the answer is, once you understand what all the pieces are doing in the context of a game that has very powerful this, that, and the other thing, oh, now I see why this might be valuable, and that, I think, is a very important understanding point for most games that have interesting build options. You need to get to the point where you get that there's kind of a context to all the options, and to say, oh, this thing is like, this is a high number for this. It's like, well, but how high is the number usually? Like, how much damage do weapons do? Is that a lot of damage? That's a very simple form of this concept. And just understanding that maybe you have a lot of damage. So another thing that does a lot of damage, maybe not the greatest, something that's more versatile, could be better. And going back to my 3-class example, there's also the element of diversity. When something is diverse, good in a lot of situations, depending on the game, that may or may not be valuable. There's some power budgeting involved with, like, in this game, the developer thinks to themselves, how valuable is it to be good against, like in your Azur Lane example, it sounds like there are other battleships and then air units. So your unit might balance output against other battleships and output against air units. And you'd have to consider, the developer has to consider, and you, the player, have to consider, how much of a price should we put on, on being good at both, being able to do good damage to air units and ground units. For example, maybe in general, the developers calculated that this ship that we're using as an example with these guns that players might reasonably have has a sort of power budget of 300. Maybe you could measure it in damage output, or health to damage output is the way these games often do it. They calculate, like, this is tankier, so it can do less damage and be effective because it takes longer to kill. It can do that damage for longer. Something like that. In these games where you have a lot of units, I think Azur Lane is like that. That's often how it goes. If the unit is tankier, it's acceptable for it to do less damage, or maybe it does damage in an area so the damage can be lower, like that. And so maybe 300 is a good benchmark. So then to make other interesting units, you want to think, okay, well, this one is 300 units of value, but a lot of the power of those total 300 combat effectiveness units is in the ship being tanky and attacking slowly. We could make an interesting strategy variant by adding a ship that is 300 units of power, but much of it is offensive power, and the ship is not very tanky, but does a lot of damage. If killed quickly, it won't be very effective, but it does do a lot of damage, so if you protected it, it's maybe more swingy. It has more of a feast and famine kind of game design thing going on. And Combining those can lead to, some basic options in the game. And then the player needs to understand that. The player needs to look at the game and understand and absorb that, oh, the merit of this unit is that it's not as tanky, but it does more damage. If I can keep it alive, it's better. You'll hear on the surface of game discussion for games like this, people declaring that one or the other unit is the best because it does like the most usually damage, and completely glossing over that it's obviously not, it could never be just the best, because other units are good at different things. They get their value out of a different thing. If a game has units that are genuinely not worth it, they have power budget, but it's not budgeted into something that is a good quality to have in the game, then the game is badly designed. That's not good game design. That element shouldn't be there, or the developers don't properly understand that. They created variety without creating value, that kind of thing. There's a lot to talk about with this subject. There are many ways this idea can incarnate and be used to extrapolate to other games and understand them quickly. This is, in my mind, one of the sort of key aspects of understanding a game's build options or customization. And if a game has meaningful diversity in how the developers have applied the concept of power budget, that is generally a good telegraph that the game is probably a game with interesting build options. And the more abstract the power budget is used, usually the more interesting the game is if the developers can keep the balance, but it gets harder and harder. For example, in Genshin Impact, for example, of the four, sort of key elements, you've got Pyro, Cryo, Hydro, and Electro. Only Electro doesn't have a reaction that magnifies the damage of the hit. That doesn't mean that's the be-all end-all, but Pyro can do Vaporize and Melt with Hydro and Cryo, and that adds a multiplier to the hit that triggered the reaction. Hydro has Vaporize still, and Cryo has Melt still. So a unit that is Hydro, Cryo, or Pyro needs to be, and is, balanced with it in mind that the player might be able to magnify the damage of that attack by applying another element first. Electro cannot do this. There isn't any reaction that directly magnifies the damage of the hit. So you'll notice, if you play Genshin Impact, that Electro abilities that do a big burst of damage do more damage most of the time, because the developers are aware that they need to be budgeted as having more value. However, you also don't have to set up that damage, so that creates an interesting trade-off where, although the ceiling, how much maximum damage you could do if you comboed things together, is generally lower for Electro attacks, the floor, that is how much damage they do given nothing else, is generally higher. And you have to decide as a player, and the developers have to decide as developers, how much you value, how valuable it is in this game for you to be able to do that thing. How easy is it to set up reactions? How often is it impossible? Are there enough good ways to set up this kind of reaction for it to be a concern that should be given proper power budget, power cost, power allocation? Or, how valuable is it to not have set up? And I would argue, for example, in Genshin Impact, that while on the surface it appears convenient not to need to set up the electro damage attacks, you're always swapping between units in Genshin Impact. That's the core of the gameplay loop. So a lot of the time the setup just happens, and it doesn't really cost you anything to just throw out some attacks of some other element before you do this attack of this other element. That just kind of happens anyway. And so it does need to be pretty powerful if an attack isn't going to have a multiplier like that. And indeed they are. You'll notice that powerful Electro units with big chunky burst abilities do generally deal a surprisingly comparable amount of damage to units that are doing some kind of Melt or Vaporize combo, unless you really push the limits of what that's capable of. And at that point, the setup really is a cost. You have to chain multiple abilities together from multiple units built to do this thing in a specific order. That is a real cost. That doesn't just happen naturally, at least it usually doesn't. But with enough planning and skill, you can certainly get higher damage. And the developers reckon that that is worth it. It's acceptable for the player to get more damage if there is some kind of opportunity cost. And that element of power budget is really interesting. You can see what I mean, I hope, by how when there's, different enough things that are added into the power budgeting, then build options get really interesting, but it gets harder to balance. It becomes sort of unknowable. There really is no answer to how much is it worth to not need setup. Well, it depends, you know. It depends on the player. It depends on the player's characters that they have access to. It depends on how long the player has spent playing the game. It depends on the player's level. It depends on the enemies. It depends how much the player thinks about this, which, like, heck all if it's possible to know that. That's just not knowable. And there you go. I think a really interesting aspect of power budget that is a bit of a departure from these is how to address that. As the developer, and as a player that talks like a developer sometimes, I often go on about how there's how games actually are and how people think games are. And this is often a pretty big problem, especially if the developers don't balance those two in some way or address that in some way. There are a lot of games that do a good job with this, in my opinion. Genshin Impact is an example. And a lot of the games that do a bad job with this, Warframe, I think, is an example of understanding, acknowledging, or doing something about evaluating in a useful way that results in a well-calibrated game, what the players think compared to what is like actually effective in the game. To give you a quick example, players may get excited seeing a very large value on an ability's damage, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the ability is good. It's just really easy to get excited about because it's obviously a large number. If a mountain is huge, people get excited. If a mountain is small, but full of awesome caves to explore, well, that's not as immediately exciting, of course. It's just how people are. They react to big things. And stuff that's popular isn't stuff that's good. Won't go on about that now. It's a mantra I always have when we talk about this topic, about what the community thinks. Developers can do a variety of things to try to get players to understand this, or at least take it into account. There have been many attempts over the years, and a lot of them are really bad in my opinion, but it's interesting, so let's talk about a few. But that's kind of what I mean, is that the game should probably, ideally, strike a balance between actually being balanced and also appearing balanced. Now, you could kind of easily do both of these things by just making the game simple. If the game is easy to understand, and every burst ability in Genshin Impact does a big chonkin' amount of damage in one hit, it's very easy to compare those abilities, and those comparisons will be largely valid. They will, for the most part, they will reflect the effectiveness of the ability if the abilities are just mostly the same, you know, but that's kind of boring. So there's that balance there. Now we're talking about power budgeting for game development. But anyway, I think it's still power budgeting in this sense, but you know, the more different the things get, the more likely the player will have an opinion about how good the things are that is less and less related to how good the things actually are. The things will simply get harder to evaluate. The player is not an idiot. It just objectively becomes more complicated. But there are things you can do about this. You can, for one, simply teach the player. Just show the player. Have the player get excited about something and then invite them to give it a go. They'll notice that it isn't actually good because they will lose or die or something, and then they'll learn that it isn't actually that good. The best example I can think of this is Magic the Gathering. Life gain. Magic is a game that is a lot about card advantage, about resource management. And your life total, your 20 life that you start a normal game of Magic with, and the cards in your hand, maybe 7 drawing on the first turn, maybe 8 if you're going second, are resources. And a lot of new players don't understand this. They're trying to win. The goal, they think, they were taught, is to get the opponent's life total to 0. So shouldn't I be excited about increasing my own life total? But generally, no, you shouldn't. Your life total should be seen as a buffer, a resource where you can ignore your opponent for a little bit, because until they get your life to 0, nothing bad happens to you. When your life total is at 1, you're as well off as when it was at 20, unless they do 1 more damage to you. And if you can get your opponent to spend a lot of time reducing your life total, but not completely depleting it, you've kind of gained something. You got a little bit of time. And this concept can be a little abstract for players to understand. Obviously, it is risky to have your life total be low, right? Likewise, cards in your hand represent resources to accomplish the killing and the winning, and using them just to restore your health, which isn't a relevant resource until you have none of it, is often wasted, and players frequently have trouble understanding this. So they'll get excited about a card that is only 4 mana, but heals them for 7 life. Whoa! 4 mana creatures often only do 3 damage. I can heal 7 with this 4 mana card? Great! But they quickly realize that while they cast the 4 mana spell that heals them for 7, and their opponent casts a 3/3 with some ability for 4 mana, they didn't really accomplish anything. They're getting closer to losing because their opponent established a resource that will do repeated damage, and they didn't do anything to stop that. Their life total's higher, which doesn't do anything, and it really just buys them time. Now, there might be a strategy where they want to buy time, sure. Obviously, if you gain 100 life for 1 mana, that's clearly very good, because you buy so much time that your opponent likely simply won't have the resources to deplete that very quickly. You bought so much time, you basically drew a bunch of cards, maybe, and provided you can kill your opponent's stuff that they get in the meantime. But it's still easy to see how if you play a whole deck of cards that increase your life by 100, it will take you a long time to die, but you will lose because you can't do anything about your opponent's threats. It will just take them a very, very, very long time to kill you. Sometimes so long that you can find another way to win, but fair enough, you get the point. This is a way Magic the Gathering does it. I don't like this. A lot of times that you buy a pack of Magic the Gathering cards, like a third of the cards are truly fundamentally useless in every situation. They're just there to help people learn that they are useless. And personally, I feel that while the amount has maybe gone down over the years of kind of new player traps in Magic, I think that there are still kind of too many, and it is very possible, it's hard, but it's possible, to budget cards so that they are good sometimes. They're just usually bad, and so the player's imagination is provoked. This wasn't effective straightforwardly, but maybe it could be, the player thinks. Let me give you a quick example. Maybe instead of putting all of a card's power budget into gaining you life, you take, maybe at 2 mana, your set mostly has creatures that have 2 power and 2 toughness for 2 mana. And you print a creature that's 2 mana, but has 1 power and 1 toughness, and gains you 4 life when you play it. This creature is usually very bad for the same reason that the 7 life heal spell was. The power budget is kind of fair. If a card is going to at least partially gain you life, I think that 1 mana for 4 life is a pretty fair deal in Magic. The problem is that the card doesn't do enough besides gain you life. It does do something else. It's a 1/1 creature. It can block some damage, but at this point, it is basically just a spell that gains you 7-ish life by blocking a creature that would do some damage to you and healing you a little. It doesn't really do anything to stop you from eventually losing, so it has the same problem. But it does do something else. So there's more potential that this card will eventually be valuable. Maybe it has a relevant creature type, and you can make that creature type better at doing damage. So just a body, doesn't matter how small the creature is valuable in a very particular strategy. So gaining life on top of that could situationally end up being very valuable. The card's power budget is sound, and the card has enough of a diversity of effects, and that's a little related but kind of different from power budget. But by keeping the card's power budget solid, you've made sure it's not overpowered, it's not underpowered. You just need the right situation, and you made sure to provide a situation where it could be good. If the card has an equal power budget, but it doesn't do anything that players frequently want to do, it's likely bad, even though it's like fair. You see what I'm saying? And so power budget is therefore not the be-all end-all as well. And it is definitely possible to make cards that are budgeted appropriately. They give you an appropriate amount of something for the cost in gameplay terms, or maybe you literally pay a resource in the game for them. But they're still not good or balanced because they give you only something that isn't valuable enough. It's really interesting how power budget is very significantly affected by how you get the thing that the card is budgeted for. In Magic the Gathering, to go for another example, there's a long tradition of cards that are creatures that gain you life, or maybe gain you life frequently. They gain you way less life, but they are a creature, and they maybe can gain you it repeatedly, like with lifelink or something. Or again, they're a decent creature, and they give you a block of healing as a bonus. A creature that is a fair rate, like a 2/2 that gains you 4 life, would, I would argue, be very good most of the time. It's not exciting, it's not great, but a lot of the time getting a decent creature that, you get life, not very valuable, but you didn't lose much either, can be very, very good. It can help you stay pace with someone who's being more aggressive and come out ahead because they'll use resources getting your health low, and you have a way to replenish it without losing the ability to stay present on the board. That can be very powerful. That is a time when I think power budgeting, by evaluating life gain as being not very valuable, can be interesting. You made cards that are never going to be overpowered, but are good, using an effect that's normally bad, by treating it as not very valuable, which it is, by evaluating life gain as being worthy of less power budget score or whatever, and then putting it on a card, only a little bit of it, on a card that is otherwise kind of a fair deal in terms of power budget anyway. It's a really good way to make mechanics that are not very good in a game be actually pretty good, or a role player in some unique situation, by just putting them, a little bit of them, on an effect that is already a fair deal. The card usually, or the effect, the card, everything is a card game, is usually not overpowered, but that will often make it be good when you want that effect. You have good sources of life gain or something. And it can be healthy for a format like Finally in Magic. A lot of the time, that prevents strategies that sacrifice everything just to get your life total low. Because if people play those strategies, you will be able to add in these cards that, while they're not a powerful strategy on their own, prevent strategies that sacrifice everything for a singular goal from being too powerful. You could always fall back on those cards, making those strategies appropriately risky. That prevents them from being overly dominant. In fact, there usually are creatures kind of like this in Magic. They might not always directly gain you life, but often like a slightly above average power budget lifelink creature that isn't really that scary in general, but prevents aggro strategies from being just like stupid by allowing you to play a card that specifically addresses them. That's really good there. Or even sometimes they have low toughness, so the aggro player can just blow them up with a damage spell, but then that damage spell didn't go at your face. And normally they would have ignored your creature, but it gains life, so they can't. And then that's an interesting push and pull. And being aware of that sort of meta thinking is also a really interesting part of power budgeting. Thinking about how the player or their opponent, if it's a PvP game, might evaluate something that the player has. For example, in Magic the Gathering, apparently, is the example of the day. There's this concept where if you leave mana open on your opponent's turn, you might do something. Your opponent doesn't know what you might do unless they memorized every card in the format, which they might have. If they're a professional player, they probably did. They don't know what you're gonna do, but you could do something. And if you're playing, let's say, green and blue, your opponent sees that you have mana available on their turn. You maybe are going to buff one of your creatures and make it stronger than they think it is, which makes them hesitate to attack. You might counter a spell they cast with your blue mana, which makes them hesitate to play a spell. They play around those effects even if you don't have them. So those effects need to be appropriately kind of taxed in their power budget allocation so that that effect isn't too strong. Nothing about the card itself is necessarily so unfair, but the existence of the effect and the kind of passive threat of its possibility means that those cards ought to be probably a little bit more expensive than they otherwise should because of the effect they have on your opponent or the rest of the game. If it's too easy to get those effects, then the threat of them is too omnipresent. For example, in Magic, it's pretty uncommon and standard for counterspells to be 2 mana. And one reason for that is that if they are 2 mana, their threat happens way too early in the game. It's like your opponent never has a turn sometimes if you go first. Your opponent never really has a turn where you might not be holding a counterspell or you couldn't cast one. If they're 3 mana, your opponent has a healthy amount of time, especially if they're an aggressive player, to play stuff not having to worry about the fact that you do have a counterspell because you just don't have enough to play it yet. This makes the card a little bit less powerful, or the effect a little less powerful, without really making it unfair. Counterspells are certainly not bad at 3 mana. You can make them playable in lots of other ways. You might increase the value of a counterspell accordingly to make it worth 3 mana, and yet just it being worth 3 mana, even if it earns all 3 of the mana, does inherently make it weaker in some way because it doesn't have this threatening presence passively, which is a really interesting way to manipulate power budget, just like when the player can get that stuff. I sometimes think of in Genshin Impact does this. There are some artifact sets, like equipment sets, early on that have pretty powerful effects, like healing you for a large percent of your health, but they're only available at very low rarities. What's happening is that effect is much more fair when the player doesn't have established powerful healers, and once they do, it would be way too strong, so they just make it not available at higher rarities, and then it ends up being perfectly fine, even though it was such a powerful effect. It was balanced because the player themselves simply isn't that powerful. So the artifacts can be relatively overpowered in some situations and kind of make up for that, kind of called that. The power budget is on the surface kind of unfair, but because of what the player has, it's contextually balanced. Or you get a really powerful effect when you open a chest, maybe. And that means that even though the power budget of the item is seemingly too high, it's getting too much value, it's designed with the knowledge that the player will only ever get that effect in a situation where power budget doesn't matter as much. The open world's difficulty is simply not as high, so it's okay to give the player something more overpowered. It's not really meant to be as power budget balanced in the open world, so it doesn't really have as much of an effect. That kind of thing, kind of interesting. Yeah, there's a lot. There's probably more to say about this subject, but I think it's just a really interesting topic to think about why effects in games, especially games with a lot of options, interesting customization, character build synergy options, why effects are priced, whatever that means in the game, the way that they are. Why maybe a Warframe in Warframe is able to have a really powerful ability because that Warframe doesn't have other abilities that are similar, or the Warframe has low health so they get a heal, or a weapon in Hades gives you lifesteal but reduces your max health, so you have to get a minimum amount of hits with the weapon or it's not actually gaining you health because you lost max health, but then you can gain some back. So unless you gain back a certain minimum amount, you actually don't have more health functionally than you did before. That kind of balancing. So like lifesteal is theoretically infinite value in a game like Hades, but in practice you have to be so and so much good with it or you don't end up getting your value out of it. Stuff like that is really interesting. There's a lot of creative and not as creative looking at a certain game in this discussion. Warframe often doesn't do this. There's often Warframes where an ability is good in the abstract, but on this Warframe it doesn't really make sense. A really good example, I think, is Titania. Titania is a pixie Warframe that can turn into a little flying drone with really good guns and a decent melee weapon. And she has these buffs she can stack up, and she's got this pixie dust that can float enemies in the air and make you immune to status. And then she has an ability that makes an enemy draw other enemies together. On a Warframe that has the ability to stun a group of enemies already, and that has a lot of reason to be repeatedly casting another ability to gain those stacking buffs, an ability that just attracts a bunch of enemies together is kind of bad most of the time in the context of that Warframe, because they have a lot of other things they'd want to be doing, reducing the value of any ability, and also another ability that can control enemies in the same environment as this ability can. If the Warframe didn't have another crowd control ability, the value of this ability would go up. If the Warframe wasn't casting as many abilities, or their abilities cast very quickly, and they don't want to use them that often, or they have long durations, they're very situational, any number of those things, or all of them, the value of this ability would go up even more. But on a Warframe that doesn't have all that stuff, this ability, which is objectively perfectly fine, is far less valuable, and should have been power budgeted accordingly to be more powerful, because otherwise it's not worth using. It's in the context of its, what is the rest of the frame doing? I think Warframe does a largely pretty bad job with this. But it makes a very good example. There are tons of things in Warframe that I think make a phenomenal example of this concept, but it is a weak spot for the game. I think that's partially because a lot of players of Warframe, for whatever reason, just don't think about that much. And the game doesn't really invite them to think about that. It's not demanding of every moment of your time being efficient most of the time, making it less important that, something fit the sort of economy of a given Warframe. You just don't have to manage that as carefully to succeed in Warframe. Perfectly fine, but a reason why the game likely is like that, and the player naturally doesn't often understand it. There are other games that do ask you for that. Genshin Impact is built around the limited time you have characters on the field, and a lot of the challenges being time focused, or you want to do them quickly. You get more rewards if you do them quickly. So naturally, more of the players understand that that is valuable. They're not really more or less valuable in the abstract in Warframe and Genshin Impact, but Genshin Impact is designed in a way where the player usually does understand that, whereas Warframe, the opposite. Even though, again, like when things are difficult in Warframe, that's often exactly what makes you better off. It just doesn't, it's not really a game that teaches the player that, and the developers maybe don't call to it as much, which is another really interesting aspect of power budget. Plenty of things in Warframe are theoretically balanced, but there's some kind of inherent problem that prevents them from making as much sense as they otherwise would, which makes it an infinitely useful buildcraft example. So I hope this was an interesting exploration of this subject. It's really important. It comes up a lot. I feel like understanding this is sort of the key to the city for a lot of games build stuff. So I hope I talked about it in many different ways that were useful. I kind of just tried to talk about it in a bunch of ways, hopefully one of which was interesting or kind of flipped a switch for someone so that they felt like they found this concept useful in some way. If you're ever confused about why a thing is in a game, evaluate what in context it might be better at, or consider, but when this is good, no matter how seldom that appears to be, is it good? Maybe it's really good to use it only when it's really, really good, or it's meant to be a role filler, or there isn't any situation like that and the developers are just bad at game design, or they don't care about that part of the game, or upon inspection the game actually doesn't really care that much what you use, and it's like Warframe, the developers are more interested in it being an artistic thing or a relaxing game to experience. Nothing wrong with any of those things, but it certainly explains a lot when you understand that. At least I think Warframe, that's very helpful. It's simply not the developer's priority. They're not stupid. They just didn't really try to balance those things. They can. They're smart enough to. They just don't. It's not because they don't know how. A lot of Warframe's design reveals that they do know how, and they simply don't apply that knowledge much of the time. It isn't because they don't know. Whereas in Genshin Impact, they have a financial incentive and a bunch of other things. The game is more about that. And so it is more consistently applied, with a few exceptions. Anyway, again, you really could go on about this forever, but I hope that was an okay adaptation of this question. Scoomslayer, you did write out a ton of examples that I didn't have a lot to do with. I apologize, from Ozerlane, but it did give me good insight into the kind of thing you were talking about, how there are different effects that I don't have context for how good they are, of course, but kind of a thing that I didn't talk about that is, I think, kind of separate, but is this concept of slot transference or versatility, the effect of a game with many different options for builds. You can put things in different places. I'm imagining in Ozerlane you have maybe I have my 3 ships and then they can each equip some guns. Or in my example with the wizard and the marksman and the warrior, they can all equip some different gear and have different abilities or spells, but only a limited number. A really important aspect of making builds, but that kind of upends the concept of power budget, is how creating an ability that affects something else that doesn't affect only itself it makes things much more complicated, and the player often doesn't really understand that is generally the predominant strategy. It's very hard to balance if you have in Warframe a primary, a secondary, and a melee, and one of those things can give benefits to another one of those things. If you don't need all 3 of those things, it's nearly always better to give the value from the one to the other, even if the value you get is very small, simply because there just isn't a reason not to. And oftentimes, if games are going to do this, they have to very carefully calibrate how much space you have. A really, really good example of this, again, I think it's a wholly separate topic, but I thought I'd touch on where power budget kind of not goes out the window, but gets very complicated, is in Fate Grand Order, where you have units that might be really supportive, but you can only have 3 units on the field at once and 6 in your team, while the unit that is on the field buffing your other units is diluting the cards you draw to get attacks with. So yeah, their buffs might be crazy. You might have a unit that doubles the damage of one of your other units, but it inherently has a drawback where it's taken up space. Like you only have so much room. You can offload, part of your team. You don't need all 6 units to be attacking. You can offload one of those slots to make a unit attacking more powerful, but there is kind of inherently a cost built in. They've really strictly limited that space so that that isn't like literally always the predominant strategy. Specifically in Fate Grand Order, characters that have some decent buffs, often kind of underwhelming looking buff effects, but which are also decent at doing damage themselves, are often disproportionately powerful because of the way the game is set up. It's really hard to balance a unit that makes everyone do 20% more damage and that themselves does more damage. Surprisingly often, that unit is better than a unit that makes one of your units do double damage, but that unit just does nothing, or they do inconsequentially low damage. Surprisingly, the unit buffing everybody way less total, but that does damage themselves, is often very desirable. Not always, of course. Plenty of times the support unit is useful. That's one thing I think is interesting about Fate Grand Order, but now we are going on forever. And again, it is kind of a different topic. There's this aspect of when sacrificing in a build situation is worth it. A lot of the time, the player is most hesitant to sacrifice. And kind of a different subject with power budgeting is going back to that thing I said about player perceived power and actual power. The player often has the biggest bias against sacrificing their resources. And so sometimes as a developer, you need to make that more powerful. But the moment you do that, players that know will make a team of catapult turtles where you sacrifice all your resources to unload big damage on your opponent. And that strategy will be really powerful for a few people, and then the whole community knows, and then that's where the problem comes from. So balancing a game so it really is balanced rather than for the player's biases is very important. Power budget is always important, even if your players don't notice, because if you don't do it right, they will notice. They will notice. In this day and age especially, some guy on Reddit will notice, and then everybody knows if it is meaningfully stronger. So I just think that's an interesting topic, but again, gets a little away from, a lot of this got a little away from the power budget is a big topic, go figure.